Andrea Acutis buried his 15-year-old son and felt nothing but regret. Not because Carlo died, but because Andrea had spent 15 years living with a saint and never noticed. What he discovered in the years after would transform him from a man who barely prayed into someone the world now calls the father of a saint. But that transformation came with a price few people talk about. This is the story nobody tells. While the world celebrated Carlo's miracles, Andrea was reading his son's journals and discovering a stranger. Every page revealed how blind he'd been. Every entry showed him what he'd missed. And 3 days before Carlo died, something happened in that hospital room that Andrea still can't fully explain. Hit subscribe right now, because what you're about to hear isn't the polished version. This is raw grief, devastating hindsight, and a father's quiet transformation that the church doesn't put on holy cards. If you've ever realized too late that someone was trying to show you something important, this story will cut deep. That distance between them started with something small. The morning Carlo asked his father to come to Mass with him, Andrea checked his watch and said he had a meeting. Carlo smiled and went alone. That moment would haunt Andrea for the rest of his life, but not for the reason you think. Because Andrea wasn't a bad father. He loved his son deeply. He provided well, showed up for soccer games and school events, made sure Carlo had everything he needed. So when Carlo started attending daily Mass at age 7, Andrea thought it was a phase. Something his mother-in-law had encouraged, something Carlo would grow out of once he discovered girls or sports or whatever normal teenagers obsess over. Except Carlo never grew out of it. Day after day, he woke up early, got himself dressed, and walked to church before school, every single morning without fail. And every single morning, Andrea stayed home, got ready for work, and told himself that supporting his son's faith meant letting him practice it, not necessarily joining him. What Andrea didn't realize was that those morning masses weren't just prayers Carlo was saying, they were conversations Carlo was having. With Jesus, real, intimate, transformative conversations that were shaping his son into someone Andrea would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. The gap between them widened slowly, almost imperceptibly. One evening, Andrea came home from work and found Carlo at the computer, not playing video games, though Carlo loved those too. He was building a website cataloging Eucharistic miracles from around the world. Hundreds of them, researched, documented, organized with the precision of someone twice his age. Andrea stood in the doorway watching his 11-year-old son work and felt something he couldn't quite name. Pride, yes, but also distance. Like he was watching a stranger who happened to live in his house. "Why do you care so much about this?" Andrea finally asked. Carlo turned around, his face lit with an intensity that made him look older than his years. "Because people need to know the Eucharist is real, Papa. Jesus is actually there. If people really understood that, everything would change." Andrea nodded, said something encouraging, and walked away. But he didn't understand, not really. To him, the Eucharist was a symbol, a tradition, a religious ritual you respected but didn't necessarily experience. To Carlo, it was the center of everything, the axis around which his entire life revolved. That gap between them would only widen in the years that followed. And Andrea wouldn't realize how wide it had become until it was too late to cross it. Drop a comment right now if you've ever watched someone you love pursue something with passion you couldn't understand. That disconnect, that feeling of being close to someone but not really knowing them, is one of the loneliest experiences a parent can have. Andrea felt it every day, but he told himself there was time. Time to figure out his son, time to have deeper conversations, time to bridge that gap. He was wrong about the time. October 2006 shattered everything. It started with a headache Carlo couldn't shake. Then came the exhaustion that wouldn't lift. Then the tests that revealed what every parent fears most: acute leukemia, aggressive, fast-moving, the kind that doesn't negotiate or wait for second chances. Andrea watched his son receive the diagnosis with a calmness that terrified him more than the disease itself. While Andrea's mind raced through treatment options and survival statistics, Carlo asked only two questions. Can I still go to Mass? Can I offer this suffering for the Pope? 15 years old, facing death, and his first concern was whether he could still receive communion. Andrea stood in that hospital room and realized he was losing more than his son. He was losing someone he'd never fully known, someone whose interior life had always been richer and deeper than Andrea had ever bothered to discover. The days that followed blurred together in a nightmare of treatments and prayers and watching his son's body fail. But 3 days before Carlo died, something happened that Andrea couldn't explain. Carlo was weak by then, barely able to speak, his body ravaged by the disease and the failed treatments that had promised so much and delivered so little. Andrea sat beside his bed, holding his son's hand, trying to find words that wouldn't come. What do you say to your dying child when you're not sure you share the same faith, the same hope, the same certainty about what comes next? That's when Carlo opened his eyes and looked at his father with perfect clarity, the kind of clarity that seemed impossible given how sick he was. Then he said something that would echo in Andrea's mind for years. "Papa, I'm not afraid. I know where I'm going, but I'm worried about you." Andrea felt his throat tighten. "Don't worry about me, I'll be fine." But Carlo squeezed his hand with surprising strength, holding on like he needed his father to really hear what came next. "Promise me you'll really know him, not just know about him, really know him." Andrea promised, not understanding what his son was asking. Not yet. That understanding would come later, in the brutal months after, when grief stripped away everything Andrea thought he knew about faith, about God, about what his son had been trying to show him all along. 3 days later, on October 12, 2006, Carlo died. Andrea stood at his son's funeral and didn't cry. Not because he wasn't devastated, but because the grief was too big for tears, too deep for any visible expression. He stood in silence while hundreds of people who had known Carlo for far less time than he had talked about the boy's faith, his devotion, his wisdom beyond his years. Andrea listened to strangers describe his son and barely recognized the person they were talking about. They spoke about Carlo with an intimacy and understanding that made Andrea realize something devastating. How had everyone else seen what he'd missed? How had his own son been more known by people outside their home than by the father who lived with him every day? The question haunted him as he walked away from the cemetery. It would continue haunting him in the empty weeks that followed. 3 weeks after the funeral, Andrea finally found the courage to enter Carlo's room. He'd been avoiding it, unable to face the empty space where his son should be, the desk where Carlo should be sitting, the bed where he should be sleeping. But Antonia had asked him to help go through Carlo's things, and he couldn't put it off any longer. That's when he found the journals in Carlo's desk drawer. Notebooks filled with his son's handwriting, pages and pages of prayers, reflections, thoughts about God and suffering and love. Andrea sat on Carlo's bed and started reading, expecting to find the typical thoughts of a teenage boy. What he found instead stopped his heart. Andrea found a letter Carlo had written, and the first line stopped him cold. "I'm not afraid of dying because I've spent every day preparing to meet Jesus. I only hope I've prepared the people I love to meet him too." Andrea's hand shook as he continued reading. Carlo wrote about offering his morning mass for his father, every single day. For years. "Papa doesn't understand yet why the Eucharist matters so much, but I'm asking Jesus to help him see. I know he will eventually. Maybe not while I'm alive, but he will." The journal entry was dated 2 years before Carlo got sick, 2 years before the leukemia. His son had been praying for his conversion daily, while Andrea had been too busy with meetings and business deals to even notice. Andrea closed the notebook and sat in his dead son's room, staring at walls covered with posters of soccer players and superheroes. The contrast between those ordinary decorations and the extraordinary interior life documented in those journals felt almost cruel. His 15-year-old boy had been praying for his conversion every morning, while Andrea had been worrying about quarterly reports and client meetings. The regret hit him like a physical force. Not just sadness, but actual pain in his chest that made it hard to breathe. He had wasted every morning Carlo had invited him to Mass. Every conversation about faith he'd deflected or changed subject. Every opportunity to really know his son instead of just living alongside him. Years later, Andrea would write about this moment. "I didn't get to enjoy my son as much as I wanted." 12 words that carried the weight of everything he'd lost and everything he'd missed, compressed into a single sentence that would resonate with thousands of parents who read it. But those journals did something else too, something Andrea didn't expect. They introduced him to the son he'd never fully known. And through those pages, through Carlo's words about Jesus and the Eucharist and suffering transformed into love, Andrea began to meet someone else he'd never known either. Someone Carlo had been trying to introduce him to all along. The introduction continued when Andrea turned to Carlo's computer. What Andrea discovered in Carlo's computer files would change everything he thought he knew about faith. He found the Eucharistic Miracles website Carlo had built, now being viewed by thousands of people worldwide who were discovering through a teenage boy's research what Andrea himself had never bothered to learn. He found documents where Carlo had outlined his hopes for the site, his dreams of helping young people discover that God isn't a distant concept, but a present reality waiting to be encountered. Then he found a folder labeled "For Papa" that contained screenshots of Bible verses and quotes from saints about fathers and sons, about coming to know God later in life, about conversions that happen through loss. Carlo had been building a roadmap for his father's faith journey, carefully curating resources he thought might reach Andrea's heart, even knowing he might not be alive to guide him through it. Andrea's hand trembled as he clicked on a video file in that folder. It was Carlo, maybe 13 years old, sitting at this same desk, talking to the camera, talking directly to him. "Papa, if you're watching this, it means I'm not there anymore. I want you to know that everything I did, all the masses, all the prayers, all the time I spent learning about the Eucharist, it was all because I found something real, not a belief system or a tradition. Something actually real. Jesus is alive, he's present, he's waiting for you." Carlo paused on the video, his young face serious as he chose his words carefully, like he knew how important this message would be. "I know you didn't always understand why this mattered so much to me. That's okay. But now I need you to find out for yourself. Go to Mass, Papa. Not for me, for you. Go and see if what I'm telling you is true. Give Jesus a chance to show you what he showed me." The video ended abruptly, Carlo reaching forward to turn off the camera, his hand filling the screen before everything went black. Andrea sat in the dark room, with tears finally streaming down his face, mourning not just his son's death, but his own blindness, his own wasted years, his own comfortable faith that had cost him the chance to share the most important part of his son's life. But something else was happening too, something that caught him off guard. In that moment of complete devastation, Andrea felt something he'd never experienced before. Not just emotion or grief or even regret. Presence. Like someone else was in the room with him, standing close, waiting patiently. Like the words Carlo had spoken on that video were not just a recording but an actual invitation being offered right now, in this moment, to him specifically. The invitation hung in the air. Andrea sat with it, feeling the weight of a choice he'd been avoiding his entire life. The next morning, Andrea made a decision. He went to daily Mass for the first time in his life. He didn't tell Antonia beforehand, didn't announce it or make it meaningful. He simply woke up, got dressed, and walked to the same church Carlo had walked to every morning for years. He sat in the back, surrounded by elderly women and a handful of other people, and watched the priest elevate the host during the consecration. Andrea didn't feel anything dramatic in that moment. No visions, no overwhelming emotions, no thunderclap of conversion. Just a quiet thought that felt like it came from somewhere outside himself. "I've been waiting for you." So he went back the next day, and the next. Not out of obligation or grief ritual, but because something was happening that he couldn't quite explain and didn't want to stop. The Mass, that had seemed like empty ritual his entire life, was beginning to feel like what Carlo had always said it was: an encounter with someone actually present, actually listening, actually responding. Andrea started reading the books Carlo had loved, works by saints and theologians about the Eucharist, about suffering, about finding God in loss. Every page felt like his son speaking to him, guiding him, introducing him to the Jesus Carlo had known so intimately. The distance he'd felt while Carlo was alive was being bridged now through the very things Carlo had left behind. The transformation showed up in small ways at first. Colleagues at work noticed Andrea started talking about God naturally, not preaching but simply acknowledging faith as part of his reality. He made different decisions about time, about priorities, about what actually mattered in the grand scheme of things. The successful businessman who had been too busy for morning mass was becoming someone who structured his entire day around it. When the Vatican opened the investigation into Carlo's cause for beatification, Andrea participated quietly, staying true to his nature. He provided documents, answered questions, shared memories with investigators. He supported Antonia as she traveled the world, giving testimonies about their son, becoming the public voice of Carlo's story. But Andrea stayed in the background, processing his own transformation in the silence that had characterized his grief from the beginning. That silence wasn't emptiness, though. It was the sound of a man finally learning to pray, finally learning to listen, finally having the conversations with God that Carlo had been having since he was 7 years old. The father was following in his son's footsteps, walking a path Carlo had blazed years earlier. Eventually, Andrea did break his public silence in one specific way. He wrote one chapter for the family's book about Carlo, contributing his voice to the story everyone wanted to hear. In it, he was brutally honest in a way that surprised people who expected a more triumphant narrative. He didn't pretend he'd recognized his son's holiness while Carlo lived. He didn't claim to have been a model of faith who understood what was happening. He simply told the truth about a father who loved his son, missed the depth of who he was, and found God in the devastating space his son's death created. That honesty made his testimony more powerful than any triumphant story could have been, because it gave permission to everyone who feels like they're on the outside of faith looking in, everyone who's missed what was right in front of them, everyone who's realized too late that someone was trying to show them something essential about life and God and what really matters. Andrea's story became a mirror for thousands of parents who read it and saw themselves reflected back. 14 years after Carlo's death, on October 10, 2020, Andrea stood with Antonia in Assisi as the church officially beatified their son. 14 years of quiet transformation that turned a cultural Catholic into a man of genuine faith, years of daily mass and prayer, and slowly learning to see what Carlo had seen all along. The ceremony was beautiful, filled with thousands of pilgrims who had been touched by Carlo's life and intercession. But for Andrea, the real miracle had already happened. Not in the official recognition or the crowds or the documented healings attributed to Carlo's intercession, but in something far more personal. The miracle was that losing his son had finally opened Andrea's eyes to what Carlo had been trying to show him all along. God is real, Jesus is present. The Eucharist is not a symbol but an encounter, and faith is not inherited or automatic, something you can coast on because you were raised Catholic. It has to be chosen, pursued, lived daily with intention and openness. Carlo had known all of this at 7 years old. Andrea learned it at 50, in the brutal classroom of grief, taught by his son's journals and prayers, and that video message recorded years before his death as a final act of love. If you're watching this and you've been missing what's right in front of you, if someone in your life has been trying to show you something about God and you've been too busy or skeptical or distracted to pay attention, Andrea's story is your wake-up call. You might have time to bridge that gap. You might still be able to have those conversations and share those moments and really see the people you love for who they truly are. Or you might not. That's the brutal truth Andrea learned. We don't know how much time we have. We can't assume tomorrow will be available for the important things we're postponing today. Share this video with every parent, every father especially, who needs to hear that transformation is possible even after devastating loss, that it's not too late to finally see what you've been missing. That God wastes nothing, not even a father's regret, not even the years we spent blind to what was right in front of us. Andrea Acutis lost his son, but found God. Not because God was hiding, but because Andrea had been too distracted to notice God was there all along, visible in his son's daily choice to attend Mass, present in Carlo's writings and prayers, active in a teenage boy's heroic virtue that should have been impossible but was completely real. The father who didn't recognize his son's holiness became a witness to it. The man who was too busy for morning Mass now structures his entire life around it. The businessman who checked his watch when Carlo invited him to church now spends his days helping others discover the same Jesus his son loved. That's not just transformation. That's resurrection. Carlo's death didn't just take something from Andrea. It gave him the one thing he'd been missing his entire life, a living faith in a God who is actually present, actually real, actually waiting for us to finally notice and respond. Saint Carlo Acutis, thank you for praying for your father every morning for years. Thank you for leaving behind the journals and videos and roadmap that would guide him to the faith you wanted him to find. Continue to intercede for all the fathers who are missing what's right in front of them, who are too busy to notice the spiritual lives of their children, who assume they have unlimited time to pay attention. Help them wake up now, while there's still time. Amen.